entrance, Will Murray, ladies and gentlemen. So we're very fortunate here as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Shadow magazine. We're very fortunate to have three panelists who are experts on the topic and who have the added benefit of having been personal friends with Walter Gibson and knowing him. So I'm going to start by asking them first, Will and then Randy and then Tony, how and when you first met Walter and what your initial reactions to him were, and just for the many people who did not get to meet him at PulpCon, just very briefly give us your impression of the kind of person that he was, the kind of guy who created the most popular version of this character that we all love and collect. So Will, you want to start that off?
Well, it was in 1975 or 6. I went down to a New York Comic Convention where Walter was making a personal appearance, and I got on the autograph line with my tape recorder and had a million questions. So while he was autographing something, I think When They Won, which was a fanzine I published at that time, I asked him some questions, and I kept asking, and people behind me were getting restless, so I stopped asking. And I was invited by Jim Steranko, who was moderating the panel on Walter, to sit in on the panel, and there I asked some more questions. Walter was very friendly, very open. I hit him with a lot of very pointed questions about the Shadow. He had good answers to them, and he's very approachable, very friendly. Liked talking about his work, himself, his character. I think if I'd have met him 15 or 20 years before, he might not have been so open because he'd had some bad experiences with the Shadow rights. So I found him to be as wonderfully informative as you could hope someone would be on their life and their career and their character.
I remember vividly meeting Walter. It was in Akron at the PulpCon in 1977, and I was there I knew he had written scripts for the Nick Carter radio show, and as some of you know, that's another big interest of mine, the Nick Carter series. And so I went up to Walter as he was browsing through in the dealer's room, looking at the magazines on the tables and shaking his head at the prices they were asking for these stories that he had written so many years before, and just asked him some questions about his days writing radio scripts. And as Will has said, he was the most approachable person. He was delighted to be asked about these things, and we ended up, he talked a little bit, and we ended up in at the bar there, having a couple of drinks and talking, and then having dinner, and then he invited me, when he knew I was going further to Syracuse, New York, to do some research in the Street and Smith collection there. He invited me to come out to Eddyville, New York, where he lived, and visit him on one of those weekends. And that was a remarkable experience, I think. But I've written up some of this in my book, Man of Magic and Mystery, and also in some other articles that I've written about Walter. But that was my first approach to him and experience, and fortunately, it was not my last.
I first met Walter a few months before Will. The Murder Inc. book tour has been happening in a series of lectures by Mystery Ray. And in February of 1975, on I believe it was a Monday night, they had Walter Gibson and John Nanovic, the editor of the Shadow magazine, to speak about the Shadow. And afterwards, I was there with a couple of comic collecting friends. And afterwards, I went up to Walter to ask him to sign my Living Shadow 1934 Ideal Library hardcover. And some of my friends were just kind of aghast. I would just go up and start talking to Walter. And we were more aghast when within 5 minutes Walter invited me to come up and spend a weekend at his house. And it was there were many such weekends, or several such weekends, and including the weekend of Walter's 80th birthday. when Walter complained to me that he was slowing down and could only write 5 books a year. But Walter had a passion for what he did. He was very alive. He had a photographic memory. As when you read in my shadow books, Will's articles based on his interviews, Walter remembered the backstory and the influence and the research on virtually every shadow novel he wrote. But he also had this delight. His favorite books throughout his life were the Oz books. He loved misdirection, and he loved magic. He loved the form of magic, and magic was so much part of his life. And of course, all of his shadow novels were based on magic.
I happened to meet Walter at that same convention that Will first met him, and as a matter of fact, I sat in on that panel, and I got to speak to him very briefly. And one of the things that amazed me even then, and I was only a kid just out of college at that point, was unlike many pulp writers who seem to be either ashamed of their work or dismissive of their work, Walter reveled in it, and he loved talking about writing. And as someone who was an aspiring writer, I asked him several questions about how he worked. And he told me some very fascinating things. And I'd like Will to tell us, this has been documented in some of the articles and some of the books, but Will, tell us a little bit about how Walter actually wrote the books, the process he used, how quickly he wrote, etc.
Well, I mean, the shadow novel.
Yeah.
Okay, well, after the first 13 and 14, everything came off a synopsis and an outline, and Walter would sit down with his editor, John Nanovic, and the the general manager, Henry Ralston, who was the grandfather of the hero Pulp, Street and Smith, and they would brainstorm 2 or 3 ideas. From that, Walter, and some of these were off newspaper clippings, magazine clippings, encyclopedia entries, Walter would prepare a synopsis that had basically 2 components, 3 components, I suppose. Backstory, which is often a page or 2, what happened before the story opened, who are the principal characters and what motivates them. He often said, what I need is a crime and a man to commit it. Then he would break things down chapter by chapter. Typically, I've seen very few Walter Gibson outlines. I've seen a lot of Lester Dan outlines. Typically, 2-3 chapters on a page in terms of development. And Walter had a third component, which I think was essentially a cast list with cross motivations. I'm not clear on that because the early outlines don't survive. And he basically outlined them to death. Okay, so that when he sat down, and he often had trouble with the outlines, and he worked out the problems in the outline stage, and tended not to have them in the writing stage. So when he worked out his outlines, he had such a blueprint that largely he just had to follow it with some improvisation or changes if necessary. Completely opposite of Lester Dent, who did a breezy outline and would often get tangled up, change too many things, and have to write his way out of a problem. So once he had that outline, which sometimes took 2 or 3 days or 4 days to write, it was a matter of following the blueprint, the complicated blueprint that he had generated, and the shadow novel still managed, despite that, to have a lot of spontaneity in it.
Walter, in an article on the business of writing that I just printed for the first time in Shadow number 48, says that in general he found that each novel took 1 day to research, 3 days to write the outlines, which he considered time very well spent, and generally 6 days to write the actual novel in the writing phase. That means 4 double-spaced typewritten pages an hour, 1,000 words an hour. And he had various tricks as a writer. He said he thought writers made a big mistake trying to finish a chapter before they went to bed and stop working. And he said he always made it a point to stop the chapter in the middle of a page, in the middle of a paragraph, in the middle of a sentence. Because he said, instead of being afraid of losing a thought, he said you can always finish a sentence that you're halfway through. You can finish a paragraph. You can finish the page. And by the time you get to the new chapter, you're warmed up. I mean, the new chapter, when you have to have that more catchy opening sentence or something, it is the point, by that time he was warmed up and just, I went into it.
And the amazing thing is that Walter wrote 283 of the 325 Shadow novels, and as mind-boggling as that total is, I mean, at his peak when he was doing 2 novels a month, he was doing something like 1,400,000 words a year at a time when the average novel was 60,000 words. The amazing thing is that was only a part of his career. Randy, when you were researching Man of Magic and Mystery, you delved into his career. Can you tell us some of the other things that he wrote? And what I want to know is how amazed were you when you started digging in and you kept finding things?
Well, obviously another big category that he wrote about was magic, because this is sort of where he came in. You know, as a boy, he went to a party and he was given, everybody was given a ribbon, and they followed the ribbon to the end, and at the end of his ribbon was a box with simple magic tricks, and that sort of started it off. But he started by practicing magic, by writing articles for magic magazines, and then eventually ghostwriting books on magic for the major magicians of the day, beginning with Howard Thurston and continuing with Houdini, and then later on with Harry Blackstone. But he always had another book going at the same time. At the same time he was writing the early Shadow magazines stories, he was also editing a magician's magazine called The Seven Circles. And in one of the early issues in that, he revealed the fact that Maxwell Grant and Walter Gibson were one and the same person. So it was never a big secret. But he always had something else like that going. And I kept stumbling in my first encounters with him. I kept stumbling over things that I had been reading for years and hadn't realized he had something to do with them. I also found a number of things that that I knew he had something to do with, but an introduction to a biography of Houdini or something. One of the most interesting things is he was involved in what he called commercial comics, writing the scripts for comic books, little comic books which were produced in order to advertise products. And one of the things that I remembered having bought through the mail as a child was from the Carnation Milk Company, was a set of little elongated comic books, one of which was about a magician's mascot, a rooster named China Boy. And it was a very fanciful story. Some of you may have even come across this. Well, I told Walter about this, and he said, "Come on, I'll show you something." And we went up to one of the upper bedrooms, and he reached under the bed. He pulled out a metal box and opened it up. And here was the mortal remains of China Boy, who had been a mascot in the magic tricks that his wife Litzka had performed. And so that little comic book was actually based on reality. But I discovered that there was a lot more to Walter than just the Shadow.
And one of the things that I'm sure will be in the next edition of your book, because I'm trying to scan them, in 1926, when the first issue came out the same month as Amazing Stories #1, there were 2 issues published by Mercer entirely by Walter. The most famous syndicated newspaper features on magic. 2 bed-sheet Pulp magazines called Modern Magic. And Gibson worked for Gernsback, did Magic Pulp magazine. Of course, magazines like Tales of Magic and Mystery, True Strange Stories, before he ever did the Shadow.
And he worked for the Philadelphia Public Ledger, which had syndicated features, and he wrote a number of these after-dinner tricks, intelligence tests, a number of other things like that, some of which appeared in newspapers across the country, and then later were collected into book form.
He was also a radio pioneer. He did his own Philadelphia area radio show on after-dinner tricks, I think twice a week, in 1923.
You know, in addition to Randy's book, which is absolutely indispensable, there are certain books that if you're a Shadow fan, you have to have. One of them, of course, is Bob Sampson's The Night Master, and Tony worked with Walter on the Shadow scrapbook. And then, of course, there's Will's indispensable Duende History of the Shadow magazine. And when I got that book, Will, I was fascinated by a concept that you explored that was actually something that Walter had done, where he had broken the magazine's history down into phases, which you then expanded upon. Give us an idea of what those phases were very briefly, and what years they constitute.
It was at an early Pulp con. Walter had been at several of them in the mid-'70s, and in talking to him about the development of the character, and I wish I could remember the conversation explicitly, I can't. He said, I always saw the Shadow as having three distinct phases, essentially a formative phase, an expansion phase, and an established phase. Formative phase, since he backed into the character. You know, he walked into the office one day at Street and Smith, and they said, we've got this radio voice, we want to turn it to a character in a series of novels for a new magazine. We need you to develop it based on our essentially rough concept, you know, mysterious crime fighter, detective. And so Walter, you know, saw it as a short-term assignment, did a novel, developed the character in the second novel and the third novel. That's how Lamont Cranston was brought into the series, and then he backed away from the whole Lamont Cranston is the Shadow, and it became Lamont Cranston is a real person whom the Shadow impersonates, and he's really someone else. We don't know who that is. Off of that was essentially the beginning phase, the phase in which he discovered his character. He found him through the sheer process of having to write these quarterly, then monthly, then twice a month novels. Well, they'd gotten to a certain point, and he'd been developed as far as he could be developed on certain levels, and he'd acquired a group of agents over the years, and all sorts of tricks and tropes and such. And that became the established phase, or the expansive phase, excuse me. And the expansive phase was the development of the world of the Shadow, the review. And after a while, they had gotten down to the point where it had settled into the Shadow was really Kent Allard and Cranston is one of the many alternate identities, and that became the established phase, which sort of blended into the radio program when the Orson Welles version of the show came on, and that had crystallized a sort of alternate version of the Shadow with Margot Lane, Lamont Cranston as urbane man about town. And over the period of mostly the 1940s, the Pulp Shadow and the Radio Shadow sort of coalesced into a blend between the two. That was the established phase. And at that point, Walter was basically turning the crank, turning in, and trying to make the stories interesting. He long since not only discovered his character, he developed him to as far as they allowed him to develop it, and then the radio show forced it to become pigeonholed into something like, but not like the radio program.
So, Tony, in addition to your scholarship on the magazine itself and your friendship with Walter, you're, of course, very knowledgeable about the radio show. What can you tell us about how Walter felt about the radio show, and was he, for example, annoyed at having to incorporate elements in, such as giving Margot a larger role? How readily did he take to that marketing requirement, I guess, of the 40s?
I think he resented, you know, the fact that what he thought was a fail started wagging the dog. I think it's quite clear, one of the things I find quite clear in the Shadow comics is that he introduced his own female aide, Walter Broom, who he tends to give the good scenes, and he plays Margot Lane largely as a butler, which he does in some of the novels, especially when he contrasts sort of with Myra Weldon. But Walter tends to be the capable one, and is a character he created. On the other hand, Walter certainly understood that this was really putting the Shadow out there, to the general public. One thing that hasn't been touched on, and I think the radio, Walter did a diary entry about 10 years before he created the Shadow on the appeal of the villain, how he always rooted for the villain. He always found the villain far more interesting than the heroes in stories, and generally far more complicated. and suddenly the hero who's been inept through the whole story ends up through some lucky happenstance, winning the day. And he always said he felt cheated. Well, Walter's, I think, major contribution in the creation of the Shadow is to take the magnificent charisma of the melodrama villain and give it to the hero. I mean, let's face it, and who's the most interesting character in Dracula, Jonathan Harker or Dracula? It's the figure in black, in the melodrama, who's the most interesting character. And the dark heroes, like Batman, are all descended from the Shadow, and the Shadow found a way to make the hero as charismatic and appealing as the villain. And of course, the Shadow on radio, I think the big appeal is you have that sinister voice. You have this thing that just, grates down your spine when you hear the laugh. You have the trappings of evil in this, which is, the dichotomy between the two makes the Shadow just this iconic figure.
Now, Walter, when I would interview him on how he felt about Margot Lane stuff, he tended to be very diplomatic. He was a team player, and if Street and Smith said it had to be, he tended to go along with it. He was not an arguer. He was a consensus builder.
But when you look, especially in the comic stories,
yeah, I'm not saying he didn't dislike Margot Lane. But basically, when they said we needed the Pulp magazine to be more like the radio show, he found a way to adhere to their wishes without surrendering his character. I mean, he did make it like the radio show without making it a slavish mirror of the. I don't think there's such a thing as a slavish mirror, but he didn't just surrender to it completely. He found a way to keep his continuity and his character largely intact with its original integrity, and just managed to he would make glancing allusions to the shadow blending of the shadows as if he could, had the power to cloud men's minds. He didn't give him that power. And he basically groomed Margot to be a more confident person after first treating her in the Pulp magazines. But in comics, you had more latitude and they expected more comedy. So he might let more true feelings show up in the comic book than the Pulp, but the comic book was not under scrutiny. The Pulp magazine was.
Right. He also, of course, introduced, when he did finally have to introduce Margot Lane, he established that she had been the girlfriend of the real Cranston, who had been romanced by Cranston on a Caribbean cruise, and when she came back to New York, she found a lot of Cranston was there, and the Shadow couldn't say, well, that was the other Cranston.
Right. Part of the Shadow magazine lore is that when they created the magazine, really as an offshoot of the radio program, the Detective Story Magazine Hour. And by the way, I want to mention at this point, for a history of the Shadow radio program, you have to go down in our dealer's room and see Martin Grams, who's written a tremendous book. And when I say tremendous, I mean literally, because it's about 800 pages thick, on the Shadow radio program. And the Shadow shorts, which we'll be showing later, he covers somewhat in his book. But anyway, part of the lore is that when they decided to create the magazine, that Bill Ralston, who was the big shot at Street and Smith, the legend is that he took an old Nick Carter story and said, well, you can just rewrite this. Randy, I'm wondering, as someone who knows the dime novels and has read the early Shadow stories, how much, if anything, do you think Walter borrowed from the dime novels in terms of form, content, style, etc., if anything?
Well, I think he borrowed very little. He was his own man on that. The idea of handing a writer an old Nick Carter and having him rewrite it was a standard practice. They would do this with any of their, the big products that they had made money off of in years past. But I can tell you one anecdote about that does not necessarily involve Walter Gibson, but years later I was interviewing Richard Wormser, who wrote the pulp novels for the Nick Carter Pulp magazine, and he was given a few old Nick Carter stories, and you'd think he'd be able to adapt them to the new format, and he read them over and he said, there wasn't anything I could use. I had to start from scratch. And I think Walter did this too. He may have, now he had not done very much fiction writing before he wrote The Shadow, and according to some accounts, he learned how the story could be structured fictionally by taking a couple of Horatio Alger novels and breaking them down into, chapters and sections, and then working those out. This is where you have the rising action, this is the falling action, everything else. I don't think that he ever really adapted any of the dime novel formats. There would be similar things, but nothing specific.
And yet, if I could make an observation, one of the things that always struck me about the series, especially in the 30s, was that Walter seemed not to have any idea what crime was like, and especially in as much as the series began while Prohibition was still in effect, he seemed to have no idea of the concept of organized crime, and his hoodlums were very much the kind of D's, dem, and does striped sweater types that you would find in an old-time novel.
Well, there are several.
Jimmy Dale.
Yeah, Jimmy Dale.
Well, first of all, Gibson had worked as a crime writer, so he'd been around that world. But he was under a lot of constraints at Street and Smith. They were not going to do the Mafia because the Mafia could hurt you.
And the Mafia published magazine
distribution. And early on, he did an early shadow novel that was based on Al Capone. That's Gang of Doom set in Chicago, and with a lot of Italian mobsters. And there were complaints apparently because Italian mobsters never reappeared except maybe slightly here and there in the shadow. He told me that he was told by Street and Smith, by Henry Ralston, not to use ethnic villains, not to use this, not to use that. I mean, there were a lot of, if they got complaints, they acted on them. So I think he was reflecting, because he was somewhat older than the pulp writers of that time, the young pulp writers. I think he was reflecting to some degree what he got out of Jimmy Dale, what he got out of the 1920s when he was a reporter, and something about something of the Sherlock Holmes, Raffles kinds of stories where there were a different breed of criminal than these scruffy Italian mobsters who were muscling everywhere. So I think some of it was, since these stories were kind of fantasies, he put in a comfortable fantasy that people would recognize even though it was outdated.
I think one thing we did pick up probably from the time novel, and his memories were hard, was the master villain. And that you had Dr. Quartz, and who were some of the other ones, Randy, the female villain?
Gazar.
And Burton
Quintard and so forth. There were a whole fleet of them who would come back from time to time. But Walter read everything, and he remembered a lot. And so, out of his reading, the Jimmy Dale stories have been mentioned. Out of his reading, he could pull elements that he could then incorporate into the shadow novels, even unconsciously.
But Walter soon learned that he just needed to develop
supervillains, yes.
The Voodoo Master, or the Cobra, or the Crime Master. And he really set the tone for the later supervillains in comic books, by establishing that you needed something beyond the garden variety Teddy Blizzard and Shadow Dale.
I think also he had direction from Henry Ralston, who worked at Street and Smith since the previous century, who was really into the Nick Carters and the dime novels. Ralston probably impressed upon Gibson to write them like dime novels, but modern. Because when I reread the first Doc Savage novel recently, it was very flat. It didn't read like Lester Dent, yet it matches the Dent typescript. And I think Dent was probably told to write it like a dime novel, or write it like Gibson, who was told to write it like a dime novel. Because you have some old-fashioned elements in a modern story. And I think I remember in a letter Lester Dent wrote to one of his later editors offering a Doc Savage plot. He said, well, this is the kind of plot that Ralston used to say we built our empire on in the dime novel days, and they were still recycling some of those conceptual plots, even though they weren't exactly the same story or type of story.
Right.
Didn't Lester say to his wife with the second Doc Savage novel, I don't care what old man Ralston wants, I'm going to write this the way I want it.
Well, I don't know if it was a second novel or what novel, but I know that Dent, unlike Gibson, tended to bristle at suggestions that he didn't care for and didn't like it when his plots were rejected, and tended to fight for being able to write it his way And it's not clear what all these frictions were. But Gibson was the opposite. Gibson would find a way to accommodate his editors, but still have his own say, his own stamp, whereas Dent tended to want to do what he wanted to do.
Well, we barely mentioned him, that we really have to say the importance of John Nadovec, who was also a former Pulpfest guest. That even though there was really a co-plotting situation going on between Ralston and Nadovec and Gibson, and Nadovec was much more than the usual Pulp writer or Pulp editor, as was Ralston, in feeding plots and developing plots for the writers.
Before we wrap it up, or throw it to questions, I should say, one thing I'd like to do, and I'm curious about this, how many folks in the audience, let's see some hands, have never read a Shadow novel? Not too many. How many have read, say, 10 or less? Okay, so there's quite a few there. What I'd like to do is I'd like to ask each of our panelists to give us a few favorites for someone who has not read many or who is just starting out, is curious about the character. 3, 4, maybe 5 of top favorites that you think are really great novels to start the series.
That's real tough to do, because every day you could have a different list. The Salamanders, which was their attempt to do a spider type of story. The Python was a good supervillain story. Zemba was one of the great Shadow novels where it took place in Paris and there was multiple confused identities. The Voodoo Master and the Shylock Khan stories are all those cycles are good. It is very hard because some of them I remember really liking a lot. I'd have to reread to reconnect with them, and I would rediscover them almost anew. I just remember how good they were.
But you've got some good ones there. Randy, how about you?
Well, I would have to go with the first 3 novels, The Living Shadow, The Eyes of the Shadow, and The Shadow Laughs, because he did something that was different from many people who developed a series. He did not tell you everything you needed to know about the hero at any point, unlike the juvenile series books, where each of the first 3 books, which were issued together, are have basic the basic concept, and nothing really deviates too much from that from there on. That Gibson told you just like a master magician. He told you just enough to keep you on the hook, so that you'd want to read and find out more. I remember, Zemba was a particularly good one that I recall. I was teaching a course in detective fiction at St. Olaf College one year, and I remember assigning, the paperbacks were available at that time, and assigning the story of Zemba in class, and finding the students were, some of them got very confused by the plot, but I asked them to outline it, and eventually one of them came up with what was, a perfect outline of that particular story. He paid a lot of attention to the ins and outs, but that would be my choices. I would
add to those several early ones. The Robe of Doom, which, while I think it's terribly padded, and I think I actually prefer the cut version, it is incredibly atmospheric. And to those of us who like the Mysterioso Shadow, before too much was known about him, really kind of a semi-supernatural figure, the atmosphere in Grove of Doom is really superb, and it actually outstrips the mystery itself. The one that I always felt was the quintessential Shadow was Lingo, which is a particularly good one, although its finale depends on a device that Gibson used many times. So it's ideal, really, if you're not too familiar with the series. But it's got great use of all the Shadow's agents. It has a tremendous action finale where the Shadow and his agents have this rooftop gun battle with hordes of gangsters. So that's a really good one. Another one that I'm very fond of is the Romanoff Jewels, which is one of the very early ones, in which the Shadow is not as prominent as some. But what's particularly unique about that one is it doesn't have a typical kind of juvenile leads who are trying to be extricated. Most of the characters are vying for the same prize, and none of them are very sympathetic. And the Shadow finds a way to deal with all of them very decisively before the end of the novel. So those are terrific novels, Tony.
Black Hush, certainly, which we just reprinted along with the Living Shadow. We just reprinted at Sanctum Books the first 3 novels with the original 1931 text, after rewritten 1934 version. Python, which just begins right in the middle with the shadow captured by his enemy, drugged. One of my favorites is Crime Insured, which I reprinted in the very first volume of the Shadow, which all of New York gangland descends to attack the Shadow alone in the sanctum. And I like some of the Hydra, which we did. Some of those novels around 1940, you get to see Gibson's wry sense of humor, and he does kind of tag team on Cranston, so the Shadow's injured in the real Cranston. And that novel really establishes how the Shadow's identical relationship with Weston as Cranston is different from the real Cranston. And he does the subtleties of Cranston's relationship with Margot as opposed to the Shadow's as Cranston's relationship with Margot. So that's just kind of, you get to see kind of Gibson's dry humor, which I also like.
And I think in closing, I would say that of these novels that we've mentioned, I think all but maybe one or two. I'm not sure you've done Romanoff Jewels yet, have you?
No, the only, purposely at this point, with the exception of Robe of Doom, had about 12,000 words cut out of it. And the first three novels, I have not reprinted any previously reprinted novels because I felt you can get them on eBay.
Yeah, most of what we've discussed, though, has been reprinted or is available in some form. Some of them were done as the paperbacks. So you don't have to go out and spend $300 for a copy of the magazine. So in the interest of time, I'm going to throw it open for questions now. I would ask you, having sat in the back of the room for Garen's presentation, it's really important when you're asking a question, please don't be shy. Stand up and tell us very loudly. It's not just a question of us hearing, it's a question of the people in the back hearing. So if you have a question, please stand up and say it very loudly and clearly. So with that, who's got questions for our panelists? Yes?
I actually have two questions. The first one's pretty easy. How did Gibson feel when Bruce Elliott took over the Shadow? And my second question is, Gibson did a lot of codes and taking words apart. What do they call it? An anagram?
Cryptograms.
Cryptograms. Did he ever help, the United States during World War II with code breaking or anything like that?
Nanovic, his editor, was the consultant on the movie serial, what was it? The Secret Code. So Nanovic did the cryptogram code section of the Shadow magazine under the name Henry Lyson.
What was the first part of the question?
Oh, how did Gibson feel about Bruce Elliott?
Oh, Bruce Elliott, yeah.
Explain who Bruce was.
Bruce was a protege of Walter's. Walter taught him to how to write comic strips for Street and Smith because Bruce wasn't that good a pulp writer. He was too visual. And they were roommates, I think, at the time. And they were both into magic. They're both magicians and writers of magic. So Walter groomed him, and then when Walter had some contract issues with Street and Smith, they approached Elliott, and Elliott took it. And Walter was left high and dry. He was upset about it for a long time, didn't speak for a long time. And Walter, off the record, Walter had some pretty pungent things to say about Elliott's Shadow stories. He thought they were wrong for the Shadow. It wasn't how the Shadow should have played. It was too modern and too urbane and whatever. And they reconciled later, but Walter once claimed that Elliott, when he tried to explain his behavior, said, well, Street Smith ordered me to write these stories. Well, Elliott was a freelancer. You can't order someone unless you threaten that they lose their market, which is obviously what happened.
There was kind of a poetic justice in the end because Gibson was to meet Elliott at a Chinese restaurant in the East Street Manhattan for lunch, and Gibson was held up at a publisher's with an editor, and he told Elliott to cancel. And Elliott left the restaurant and was run over by a taxi cab and was hospitalized and never recovered. And if Gibson had made that lunch date, Elliott would have probably lived for many more years.
Well, of course, I'm judging this by some of Gibson's opinions in his later years, and he could be very ambivalent about the other people, the other Maxwell Grants. Sometimes he could praise their work, and sometimes he would not have so many good things to say about them. I think that, yes, I think what Will says about Bruce Elliott, that he felt he was not doing the real Shadow in those stories, and they were cut down something. But it's interesting that that he found somebody in the magic community who he could groom to succeed him.
We're getting a high sign from the back. We have to get the auction going, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here, but our guests will be around. I'm sure you can ask them additional questions tomorrow in the dealer's room. And the words expert panel are tossed around rather promiscuously, but I think in this case we can really say that it's so. So let's give a big round of applause to our panel.